Hi, this is Don Cusic with the Music Biz, and today my guest is Brad McCuen. Brad has had a quite a distinguished career in the music industry, has been a record executive, has been the head of a record company, has been a producer, produced a number of people, everyone from the Blackwood Brothers to Ronald Reagan to Duke Ellington and quite a few in between. He has or is quite an expert on jazz. Has had a radio show on jazz on public radio for quite a while. Brad, let me begin by asking, how did you begin?
Well, it all began one day back on Long Island where I grew up, and one of our neighbors at that point were an orchestra leader and his wife, Mildred Bailey and Red Norvo. And their nephew and I were pals. Red heard me playing Ted Fiorito and Bing Crosby records for their nephew, which were the first recordings I had. And he said, "Oh, kid, don't listen to that." He said, "Here, this is jazz," and and Red on rainy days would go into a record shop and play records all afternoon and buy, a tremendous number, and he would duplicate. He would forget that he had certain ones. So he called out a group of duplicates and gave me 40 or so records, 78s. He says, "Kid, take these home and listen to them. That's the truth," And I took them home, and I would like to say immediately the skies opened up. They didn't. It took me a little while, even with Duke Ellington, to have the. It was subtle music, and it wasn't the obvious kind that I'd been hearing. This in the 35, 36 period, I went on to play guitar in a high school dance band, but later when I got to the University of North Carolina and looked around to see, if there was a chair open, every third student at Carolina played guitar, forget it. So at that point, a chap that ran for governor of North Carolina, Skipper Bowles, had a band, and they needed a road manager or a manager, or just somebody to do the business end of it, and I volunteered, and so I had that experience. I booked the bands, the name bands in for our college weekends, and this gave me experience. Also, summer vacations, I worked as an announcer. The term disc jockey hadn't been invented yet, and at small radio stations in northern New York and Vermont. And really it amounted to giving station breaks and reading commercials. There weren't that many in those days. It was before the jingles, really, and an occasional record show. So after World War II, I did get into the record business. I got a job with a small record company, Majestic Records, and started out as a salesman on Long Island, and then worked up to the prime New York City, the Midtown Manhattan area, and was doing quite well financially, but I could see it was a small company, and really this was no be-all. So the word went around that RCA was looking for trainees, young men, and so I volunteered, passed the tests, and moved to Camden, New Jersey. And from that point on, I felt that I was a company man. And I had almost 22 years with RCA when I left, as a field man and as a producer.
What did a trainee do? I mean, what were some of the things you had to do?
All right. Well, they wanted us thoroughly grounded. And my first area was the advertising department, and in those days RCA had the J. Walter Thompson agency, the corporation RCA did, But most of the record advertising was prepared in-house. And so for about 3 weeks I worked with them. I then had a month working in the order service department, and we were all stunned to find that I was an inverter. Do you know what an inverter is?
No idea.
It's a person that has difficulty with long numbers, like a telephone number. Unconsciously, I have a tendency to take the last 2 digits and reverse them.
Uh-huh.
And in taking orders over the telephone from distributors in Boise or Butte, Montana or New Orleans, when you make a mistake on a number like that, some poor guy out, in Seattle is going to get a Southern blues record in quantity that he didn't order. So quickly I was told to watch that, and they put me on a different job. But I also worked in the pressing plant there in Camden, did a time study, the hottest days of the summer, and I mean to tell you that was how those, they were mostly women that pressed the records in those days, no automation. It was, and it was brutal, even for me, and all I was doing was holding a pad and, you know, that sort of thing. But we worked in every department, and we got a thorough grounding. It was about 8.5 months that I had, and then RCA had been sending brilliant young Yankees down south here to act as field men, and the southern distributors had been chewing them up and spitting them back. And because I had 4 years of college in the South, they figured maybe I knew something, you know. And so I became the Southern field rep, and was able to cover it. In fact, I kind of thought that maybe they'd forgotten about me. I was typed for life, and that I lived in Charlotte, North Carolina. The western extent of my territory was Nashville, and on out to Jackson, which I only got to once in the 7.5 years that I was the southern rep. But then I was transferred to Chicago and did the same thing there, and I'd been quite critical of some of our releases. I'd also helped Steve Scholes an awful lot. Steve was responsible not only for the country records, and he's in the Country Music Hall of Fame up in Nashville, but he was also responsible for specialty recordings, which included rhythm and blues, the gospel, children's records, and things like that. And business had increased so that he made me his assistant, and I took those some of those functions over. Steve was producing Elvis Presley at that point. He had just acquired Elvis and a number of other really important artists, and I fortunately was able to cut my teeth in production with very simple projects, and therefore I didn't goof badly, and you know, like with a Perry Como or an Eddie Fisher, and I made my mistakes and learned from them, and that sort of thing. So.
Getting back to Majestic, now what kind of music did they put out?
Well, record companies in those days tended not to specialize. They had something for everyone. Majestic's top artist was Eddie Howard. To Each His Own was a million seller. But they also had the Three Sons, Ray McKinley and his orchestra, good Lord, Georgia Gibbs was just starting out on that label. Mildred Bailey, she and Red had become divorced by that time, but they did some jazz, some country, which wasn't really, the records are real collector's items today because they were not Nashville or even Southern. They tended to be northern country and were rather unique. But there was, right across the board, Alfred Newman and the 20th Century Fox Film Studio Orchestra also made recordings for them. I left them at the beginning of the recording ban to join RCA, and so the company didn't last too much longer than that. No connection between those two, but
you weren't holding them up?
No. The recording ban of 1948, in which the Musicians Union prevented any recordings being made from January 1st until I think it was December 14th of 1948, they weren't equipped financially or with enough product to weather that, and that put them asunder.
Okay. Now, at this time, the record industry consisted of 78s.
Yes.
And your job consisted of going into record stores and radio stations too, or just record stores?
Yeah, a radio station too, because promotion at that point was a minor thing, and the radio stations, most of them were buying their records at a record shop, or the record shop was giving the radio stations the records in exchange for an announcement or something. And Majestic did have a very good disc jockey service in that they pressed up the records in the Muzak pressing plant on a good cherry vinyl, and they sounded just super. Our problem was that the pressed records, the shellac records that the customers bought, sometimes didn't sound quite that good. But
so you would take them into the record store, see if there was an order.
Well, I would do my best to expose the weekly new release, and in those days we issued records every week, usually about 2 or 3 pop records, maybe 1 rhythm and blues, 1 country, and 1 international, or something like that. And we had about 2 albums a month, and albums in those days were 4 or 5 78s on a real album, you know.
Suitcase, yeah.
Yeah.
It doesn't, it doesn't seem like it's that different today in getting records out and getting exposed. And
no, well, of course, the radio stations are really the key to it. If a record isn't exposed over the air, your chances of getting it played are getting it sold. The public has no way of hearing. The sad thing to me today is that there are a tremendous number of great recordings that are made available, but their market, the people who would love to own them, don't even know they exist. And it used to be, in the early days, you could walk into a record shop and there were very knowledgeable people that would say, now you like Hugo Winterhalter, there's a Percy Faith here that you might really like, that type of thing. I picked those 2 artists, particularly in jazz, where it's involved music, or classical. Getting an expert opinion, and those clerks used to be that, and today it's only the hot 100 albums, and then forget it. That I think is something that is bad in today's marketing in the record business.
When you joined RCA, who were their biggest artists?
Oh, well, when I joined them, Perry Como, Vaughn Monroe, Tommy Dorsey, also Eddie Arnold. Eddie had kind of come out of left field during World War II, and he was even selling in those early days to the pop market. I can remember the New York distributor being stunned when he was getting orders for an Eddie Arnold thing. Don't Rob Another Man's Castle, or of course the big hit was Bouquet of Roses that I think eventually went $1 million. But Eddie's big hit, and he had several before that too. Eddie Fisher and Frank Sinatra covered Eddie Fisher with "Anytime," which was originally an Eddie Arnold country hit, and I've forgotten the one Frank Sinatra covered.
Was Sinatra on RCA?
No, he was on Columbia.
Yeah.
Columbia at that time. But RCA, of course, their Red Seal department was a huge moneymaker, the symphony orchestras and opera stars and complete operas and that sort of thing. The international business was important. The ethnic groups in the United States, the Greeks, RCA would issue from Greece the recordings. German recordings from Electrola, the affiliated company with RCA in Germany, around the world. And of course, Mexican and South American and Cuban. Oh, it's tremendous business. In New York City and Miami. And the Mexican records, of course, sold beautifully in Southern California. So there were many, many different aspects of the record types of music that.
Were you based in North Carolina or Atlanta?
Well, I had an office in Atlanta, but I lived in the geographical center, and part of the reason that we did this was that Atlanta wasn't quite, in those days, the hub that it is today. And I had Virginia, North and South Carolina, Tennessee, except for the ring around Memphis, parts of Kentucky, Georgia, and Alabama were my territory. There was another chap, Ray Clark, who was the field man, and he did live in Atlanta. And Ray and I shared a secretary, and I did have an office, and I guess I was expected to go to Atlanta to do my correspondence and that sort of thing, but I, being an ex-newspaper type, my two fingers really did a job, and I could get my correspondence done myself, and I didn't have to bother with that trip to Atlanta. So
you basically did a lot of the same things with RCA as you did with Majestic in selling records, taking them to...
Well, no. With Majestic, I had contact really only with the dealers, and it was a selling job. And it was a difficult one because in those days, there wasn't such a thing as having a hit version of a song. Actually, there were hit versions, but the cover versions or the alternate versions would also sell, not quite as well. What is an example? Well, the Bing Crosby movie films, the scores would be That Sly Old Gentleman from Featherbed Lane. Well, Bing would have his record out, but his record company, Decca, at the time, would also bring it out in a dance version by Russ Morgan and his orchestra. And over on RCA, Vaughn Monroe would record it. On Columbia, Kay Kaiser. On Vocalion, there could be Lawrence Welk, who was recording dance tunes then.
Was that because it was so hard to find a hit song, or?
Well, no. The songs were the hits, not the performance of the song necessarily. That was what the Lucky Strike Hit Parade was all about. The songs were the ones that people went in and said, "Do you have Thanks for the Memory, that new song?" "Oh yes, who would you like it by? Guy Lombardo or so and so and so and so?" You know, that type of thing. And gradually, and I guess during World War II, is when the customer would come in and would say, "What's new by Perry Como?" You know, that...
and that happened after World War II?
I'd say during it. World War II was such a punctuation because of the number one. Most of the men were in the service and or away from their jobs and homes, and the musicians union had another strike, one that started in mid-1942 and went practically through 1944. And the record companies were in no desire to settle it quickly because they couldn't press records. A wartime manufacturer made records the least important thing, and they couldn't get the virgin shellac from India. So the quality of the records that were pressed during the war were dreadful. So those two factors kind of put a real, as I say, a punctuation mark. And also what happened musically was everything had been the dance band, and the social ethics or customs of the young people had been to go to dancing, go out to dances or go dancing, and either to the name bands or to the local bands or combos. Well, without the young men around, the girls would go to not bars, I don't, you know, or the
right.
whatever the nice equivalent was, and naturally, no dancing. I don't think that they really enjoyed two girls dancing together particularly. It always kind of shook me up a little to see it. What a waste. But the singers then were delivering the lyrics of these songs, and the lyrics became more important, and as well as the singers. Perry Como for years had been the dance band vocalist with Ted Weems in his orchestra. And but during the war, you know, all of a sudden, boy, and Frank Sinatra, of course, everyone knows he was with Tommy Dorsey and Harry James before Tommy. But so the age of the singer came along. Also Nat King Cole, and who didn't sing in the early days. It was his trio, the Nat King Cole trio, and they piano, guitar, and bass, and they had fine sound. And then Nat, in his unusual voice, started to sing, but this was a couple of years down the road. But
tell me about Steve Schultz.
Oh.
Just talk about Steve.
Have we got a week? No, Steve was my hero. He represented everything I had hoped I could be, and which I missed pretty regularly. Steve was, I thought, one of the really true gentlemen of the music business. He was a man who knew, he went to Rutgers, and he played saxophone and violin in a dance band while he was there. Steve's dad worked for RCA, the old Victor Talking Machine Company, and his summer vacations, he didn't playing in a band, but he became a mail boy at RCA Records. And then Steve loved jazz, and in 1938, when he graduated, was it, or 37, I guess it was, he went to work for RCA, and RCA Manufacturing Company in Camden, and gradually got into the recording end of it. He was drafted fairly early, despite the fact that he was married, and because of his experience in the record business, he was one of the first men that was put into the V-disc section of the Army. V-discs, I'm sure not many of your viewers know, but during World War II, the armed services knew that the overseas troops were missing a lot from home. And each month they would put together about 25 12-inch pressed records, 78s of course, and they had a field phonograph that each unit got one, and they'd send this package of recordings overseas. They weren't made for consumption in the United States. That was one of the provisos that the Musicians Union and the artists had asked. So they weren't in competition with the regular records. And troops coming back into the United States, if they had any V-discs with them, they were confiscated at the dock. I know I lost about 30 that way. But the special recordings were made by the artists. Some of them had been taken from radio broadcasts, some made specially for V-discs. Others were popular hit records of that particular day. And Steve was one of the producers for them. Another producer was George T. Simon, who is quite an eminent author and good friend of one of your retired professors here, Clay Tucker. And he and George Simon were good buddies back pre-World War II. But let's see, Steve Scholes. After the war, of course, he went right back to RCA, and one of the first records that he produced was Elton Britt's There's a Star-Spangled Banner Waving Somewhere.
Which was a big hit in World War II.
Oh, yes, tremendous.
Can we stop now? We're going to end part one of this interview with Brad McCuen. And Brad, I think we're going to have to keep going to parts 6, 7, and 8. But let's end part one right now. This is Don Cusic with the Music Biz. And my guest is Brad McCuen. Oh, goodness. I'm going to have to get you down here.
5, 4, 3, 2.
Hi, this is Don Cusic with the Music Biz. And today is part 2 of the interview with Brad McCuen. And Brad, I want to ask you today about jazz. Now, first of all, Brad has garnered 7 or 8 Grammys, depending on whether you count and help me make it through the night. But some of those Grammys came with Duke Ellington.
Right.
Tell me about how that came about and how you began working with Duke Ellington. Well,
at record companies, jazz tended to be a dirty word. With a few possible exceptions, it was the easiest way for a producer to find himself unemployed. And I had watched a whole series of gentlemen pass through the Nipper land, RCA Records. All of them came in with great expectations and high hopes, and jazz is a specialty music. It wasn't ever a general music of the general population. And it's also so great in its own way that people tend to lose objectivity, producers in particular. And Steve Scholes was a jazz fan, despite the fact that Steve is in the Country Music Hall of Fame. I think Steve and I had an understanding of each other from the simple that we both suffered from the fact that we loved all music, not just country music or jazz, but classical music. And in fact, the only music that I really haven't gotten deeply into was or is opera. And that probably, if were I to have enough time, would come. But Steve was the same way, and Steve was also a closet man like myself. We didn't go around talking about jazz because we didn't want to be labeled and have that hurt us professionally. And Steve was responsible for not just the country recording, but the rhythm and blues, the comedy recordings, the gospel or sacred music, children's records, a wide spectrum of the various musics. But when Steve became head of the A&R department, this is circa 1962 or so, there was a move on at RCA to drop all jazz. George Avakian had just left the company, and budget-wise, they had done very poorly, and Steve said, no, I believe in the philosophy of something for everyone, and if I'm going to be in charge, we'll have jazz. And he asked me would I be the producer, and I said, no, Steve, I don't want to get fired, and he said, no, as long as I'm here, he said, you don't have to worry. But I think that, you can do it. Your tastes and mine are similar. And so I, with a slight reticence, did agree. And I had started the vintage series of reissues, and I was mother henning that. And so he said, hire an assistant, and I did. Mike Lipskin came in and took that kind of a burden away, and I was able to sign some pretty good artists. Earl Hines, I inherited Gary Burton, that Chet Atkins here in Nashville had signed, and then added Lionel Hampton at one point, and of course Duke Ellington. And Duke was the highlight of my life.
How did you find him? How did you know about him?
Well, I was at the Monterey Jazz Festival, and Norman Granz, who produced and became a multimillionaire with his Jazz at the Philharmonic and the Verve label, which he sold to MGM. When he sold Verve, there was a proviso in there that for 7 years he would stay out of the record business, and he wouldn't be competition to his ex-label. And it was during that period with Grants, and I get a phone call from Norman out while I was at the Monterey Festival, and he said, how would you like to have Duke Ellington? And I said, well, name your price. I'd love it. And there was a reason, and I guess it won't hurt to tell the story now. Duke left RCA and vowed never to return in 1946. An unpleasant racial situation occurred. A producer had walked into a Duke Ellington session, and in those days the control room and the producer's cubicle were soundproof, and the way you communicated in the studio was with a talkback, a speaker, and it had a switch that when you pressed down, you could talk on it and lift up, and it cut that mic off. Well, the engineers were there, and Duke and the orchestra were getting ready to record, and this producer, Duke's producer for RCA, his producer, walked in, and he said to the white control room crew, he said, all right, are you ready for a little nigger music? Well, the last time that they had talked out in the studio, the button had stayed on. They didn't know it, and of course that went out and was heard by Duke and the whole orchestra. And if ever there was a gentleman, it was Duke Ellington, a very elegant and proper individual, and he looked at the orchestra and said, gentlemen, pack up. And they had heard it, so of course they started putting their instruments away, and this producer got on his knees, and Ellington wouldn't even look at him, just walked out. Later, it was pointed out, the lawyers did, that the contract had to be fulfilled, and Duke said, I don't want that man anywhere near, and he wasn't. And but when the contract was ended, that ended Ellington, and it was a bad taste in his mouth. And I said to Norman on the telephone, I said, will Duke come back to RCA? And he said, well, Duke's very close to Stanley Dance, and Stanley thinks a lot of you. Stanley and I had been working on a number of vintage projects, and so I said, well, God bless Stanley, and yes. And so I called Steve Scholes and got an okay, and we signed the contracts, and it, as I say, was one of the greatest experiences of my life. We started off with the first sacred concert, which we recorded at the Fifth Avenue Presbyterian Church in New York. Then we did the Far East Suite, and I had held out. The set that Duke didn't want to do was the rehashing of his old great standards that, of course, the public wanted. Mm-hmm. And so we did that. The band was getting ready to go to Japan, and we're on the West Coast, so I recorded the album, The Popular Duke Ellington, out in Hollywood, and everything just came off right. And then we did a piano workshop thing with Duke, and the heartfelt album was Billy Strayhorn died, victim of cancer, and we wanted to do a tribute to Billy, and but it was just too emotional right for the first couple of months, and eventually Duke was ready to do it, and we really Duke had delivered the eulogy at the funeral, and anybody that ever knew Sweet Pea, which was his nickname, Sweet Pea, Billy Strayhorn, he was a tiny little chap, but a multi-talent. He was Billy, mm-hmm. And you couldn't imagine him being and Duke ended his eulogy with, and do you know, his mother called him Bill. Just, you couldn't, if you knew the man, he wasn't a Bill, mm-hmm. He was Billy, and so we did that set, and of course that won a Grammy. In fact,
how did Duke approach his sessions? Did he come in all prepared? I want to get at your role as a producer. How much real producing or well, with Duke, you don't get too many cracks at takes. Mm-hmm. So, no, I'd say he came in beautifully prepared. The orchestra has to be very alert with Duke. For instance, when we were making the popular Duke Ellington, which were the standard, so to speak, mm-hmm. The way Duke would do it, he'd sit down at the piano and he'd play a chorus, sometimes two choruses. And the band would listen and know Duke would always leave a little hole, sound-wise, where we could get in, and then the band would come in, mm-hmm. 16 men playing exactly right, that type of thing. The piano parts, and I hate to tell you, but I discarded them. They're still in the RCA tape vault, but I should have kept them because they were little gems themselves. Of course, you don't want 2 minutes of a piano solo unaccompanied and then into the full band thing, so we cut them off. How was Duke to work with? He was exceptional. You usually got about 2 takes, complete takes, and if he liked the second take, that was it. And sometimes there would be something that would happen in the control room that Duke didn't know about, mm-hmm. And I would go out and I'd say, Ellington, we need another take, technically, mm-hmm. And occasionally there would be something that he didn't hear because he was seated at the piano. Mm-hmm. He'd get up and conduct, but
that he wouldn't hear, and that sort of thing. And I didn't have to do very much editing, so to speak, of one take to another in anything that he did.
Jim Fogelsong told me that he didn't like working with jazz people because they always wanted money. They were always broke and always wanted money. Did you find that too?
Only certain of them. I had one artist, well, Jimmy Witherspoon, who was a blues artist that came out of Kansas City jazz, Jay McShann's band, and became a name as a blues singer. And he was one of the artists I was really a little afraid of physically, because he could have cut my circuits down pretty quickly. He is a huge chap and very physical, in good shape, and also an interesting thing. I would take to the recording session a series of checks that I kept, and he was paid, I think it was $250 a side, and I had to be ready to pay him at the end of the session, but I never knew how many sides we'd get, so therefore, forget it. If I overpaid him, no such thing as tomorrow, I'll pay you back. Yeah. So I had the accounting department prepare the graduated series of checks and would pay him in that manner. But other than that, most of the artists, I don't remember. What was this with Witherspoon? I thought a minute ago. Oh, well. There they go.
Let me ask you about jazz today, if we can jump to today. How is jazz marketed? How do people find out about it?
Well, again, it's a cult music. There are several publications that really go into it. And jazz today is a lot of musics. It's not just what we used to think of as jazz. It's rock music, fusion jazz, the avant-garde or free form is practically classical music in certain aspects. So downbeat is not as important as it once was, but radio-free jazz, well, pardon me, they now call that the Jazz Times. It's a monthly newspaper. And there are a number of others that are Coda is a Canadian publication that's awfully good, and Cadence. All of these are intelligent approaches to the art. And
so what you're saying is that print is the most important medium for jazz?
Print plus National Public Radio and the college radio stations are extremely important. In fact, Columbia Records had an employee that did nothing but contact college radio stations living in Nashville on jazz. So, of course, he traveled, I guess, south to New Orleans and to Atlanta and all that, too. But again, radio and the print.
Okay. How about personal appearances? Do they count?
Always. Well, they sure don't hurt unless the artist gives a bad show. Yeah, I had several artists that I signed that were not performing artists. They weren't touring artists, and I resented the fact that they didn't tour. The simple reason that otherwise, we would have sold more records. J.J. Johnson, the trombonist, was one of those.
What does a good jazz album sell now? Is there such a thing as an average sales and then?
I don't really think so. And I'll tell you, the way the record business is today, you either are a fantastic winner or, an also-ran. There isn't the middle ground that there once was for the name artists. The small cult labels, and I do liner notes, album notes for some of them, specialize in one particular part of jazz. For instance, Concord Records out of California only really operates in the mainstream jazz field. They're not trying fusion, nor are they trying the traditional old-timey stuff. George Buck in Atlanta, my God, he's got about 5 different labels or 6. Each one is keyed to a certain, the Revival Dixieland bands is one label. Audiophile is another one of his labels that goes for singers and sound type things. And
I know that there are jazz on major labels, but what you're telling me is that the ball is carried forward by the independent labels.
I really feel that this is true. Yeah. Now, you get a Dexter Gordon, for instance, a man that was part of the very beginning of the bop movement, right during World War II, and who has been in the kind of the middle ground in jazz all these years, and then he makes the movie in France around midnight, and Time magazine gives it, was it a cover? I don't know, something like that.
Big story.
And this has revitalized his career, and of course he's on Columbia Records, and I'm sure they've sold a whole batch of the things. I was a little shocked to find that the movie played in Nashville only 2 weeks and was gone.
Can you profile a jazz consumer?
No.
What kind of person would?
Well, no, I can't. I think what you have to do is to select a type of jazz, Dixieland as an example. Well, this is a man who is retired or presently the president of several banks, rather affluent, and he and the wife enjoy going to the islands or Florida, and he goes first class, and once or twice a year they go down to Texas to hear Jim Callum's Dixieland Jazz Band, that type of thing. That's one type. I'm not sure that there are many people under 40 years of age that are buying those records. The swing records, or the big band period, the music of the 30s and 40s, I think is more general, that your dad and mother probably are still into Benny Goodman and Tommy Dorsey and that sort of thing, and they did do jazz recordings apart from the dance band things. And so you get to bop and progressive in the Stan Kenton school, and that, I think you find that it's a younger audience today that's listening, and these tend to be the people with real musical ability, musicians, maybe amateurs, but still musicians that know music, and so they're the ones that really appreciate some of the extreme subtleties in jazz. And the avant-garde stuff or the fusion jazz, I tend to think of just people. To me, fusion jazz, most that I've heard, is about 60% rock music and about 40% from the jazz values. And that's watering the tea down too much for me, really.
Would New Age jazz be watering the tea down a little further?
Yes. Again, it's tragic that jazz, that the word hasn't been replaced, because there should be more descriptive titles, anyway, for these various schools of jazz.
Well, let me ask you something. The fusion jazz, I know a lot of young people are in it, and the yuppie jazz, the New Age jazz, Rhythm Hill jazz, has attracted a lot of people. Has it given jazz a shot in the arm, or is it so far removed from the roots of jazz that it hasn't helped?
Well, who knows? Jazz is an evolving music in any event. It's constantly changing, unlike and this, some of your more knowledgeable people in classical music would attack me for saying, but there is a music that's relatively stable. you do have John Cage's and some
Philip
of the
Glass
people
and
that,
those people,
right, Glass, yeah, who are changing it, but they're in such a minority that really the three Bs are there. We don't have that in jazz because our three Bs, going back to Dixieland, really, if you've got a lot of musical ability, you're soon going to tire of much of that, the format that it has to follow. So what you've done is you've moved upward into more subtle types of jazz. But
did it bring any young people into jazz? Because I mean, that's what I'm seeing with fusion and with New Age.
Yes, I think it most certainly does. And one aspect of it is certainly employed. I used to use Herbie Hancock on record sessions when I needed a good pianist. He was with Miles Davis's group at the time, and Miles didn't work a lot. He didn't need to. I mean, he worked for the top dollar. And Herbie and the band, or the group, it was a quartet, I believe, would be around New York, and if he was available, I'd say, hey, you know, can you work my session tomorrow night, you know, or something. He was a delight, a very fine musician. He could play anything, you know, that type of thing. And but, you know, he was one of the early ones that really got into the electronic and the this sort of thing. And I guess, is a millionaire because of it. So it's been good from that standpoint. It also may light a few fires. People that are like the Herbie Hancock of the modern thing will say, gee, I like him. Here's an old record. I wonder what it sounds like it was 10 years ago, or you know, so, and they'll go back into it and become really into what I consider a purer form of jazz.
How did your jazz radio show get started?
Well, there was a chap named Joel Seguin down at WPLN, and when Ellington died, I was torn. I wanted to go to the funeral, but then I thought, and certainly was invited, financially, that you know, it was really something, and there was something else, and that I didn't go. I'm not much for funerals anyway. But at any rate, Joel had a memorial program for him on a Saturday afternoon, and knew I had been Duke's producer, and had me down, and we enjoyed talking and for about 2 or 3 hours, and you know, I do talk. So the radio station, Dr. Cal Bean there, had said, how would you like to do a show? And I said, well, I don't want to carry it myself, but I've got a buddy here, Bruce Davidson, and so we talked about it, and we formulated the show, you know, that sort of thing. And the way we worked it, so there wouldn't be an awful lot of work. It was a weekly 1-hour show, and we didn't do it lightly. We really put some preparation into it. We'd record every second week, and we'd do 2 shows at one time. Bruce would write one show, and I'd write the other. And when I say write, I mean basically put it together. And we had a changing format. We were very conscious of not mixing various styles of music, putting that old traditional music along with some more avant material. And our listeners, if they tuned in and only liked modern jazz and they heard Jelly Roll Morton, they knew, I'll see you next week, boys, and twisted the dial.
Okay.
But again, we were very proud of what we accomplished there. At one point, when Prairie Home Companion was just starting, we had a far larger listening audience than they did, according to the Arbitrons.
Probably brought some listeners in for them.
Yeah, and then eventually the tables were turned, and we were inheriting their listeners.
Yeah. Brad, thank you. This is the end of part 2 of the interview with Brad McCuen. And this is Don Cusic with the Music Biz.